So we're entering our very last phase here. We have one final keynote speaker. We're very fortunate to have Peter Singer join us from Toronto. I've known Peter for a number of years as a close colleague and friend, truly an inspiring leader in the global health space. Peter was at the University of Toronto, still is at the University of Toronto, as a bioethics expert, one of the leading voices on bioethics around the world. He saw a tremendous need as he was going around the world and observing. And I remember at I think it was an American Academy of Pediatrics meeting a number of years ago, he sat me down and he said, "What do you think about an initiative saving brains?" And it was just like, wow, that's exactly what we need. As I began my comments at the beginning, this is where global health is going. We have got to maximize the opportunity of children to survive and to become productive, happy, well-being adults with well-being. So Peter went on and formed Grand Challenges Canada and has led that organization for the last 5 years and has focused on a number of initiatives around saving brains. First of all, understanding the extent of the problem, the implications of the problem, how you measure the problem, how you intervene upon the problem. His organization has produced over 700 innovations in more than 80 countries at this point. I won't go on to list his many honors that he's had. There are many. I would like to say, however, I think Peter is really driving a whole new way of doing development. His organization has been extremely results-driven, certainly innovative, but very focused on results, very focused on being open about the ways in which they go about their business, bringing communities of practice together and coming around the table as equals to discuss these issues and to look for solutions in all possible places. So it's with great delight that I introduce Peter Singer to talk about saving brains, innovations to help children thrive.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's really a privilege to be here with all of you and with Gary, who's been such a leader in child health and such an early advocate of Thrival, a term I think Vishwajit actually, I first heard it from Vishwajit many years ago and his terrific work. And Gary's also had a lot to do, as he mentioned, with the formulation of this idea of saving brains. And what I'd like to do in the next 30 minutes or so is just give you an overview of what is a portfolio of innovations that are trying to really shift the focus from survival alone to also include thrival for children in low and middle income countries. And it's a portfolio that's now developing in partnership with many other organizations that you can see listed. Many of those organizations have complementary portfolios, but as Gary mentioned, we're all working together really to try and keep the focus on the end beneficiary, which is the world's children and their opportunity to thrive. This is one of many grand challenges that you will have heard of. Saving lives at birth is another one. And it's part of the broader Grand Challenges movement, but it's one that really has brought focus onto this issue of thrival, I think. And you see it spans even into domestic governments, like the government of Ethiopia, which recently launched its own Grand Challenges Ethiopia and wanted to focus on this problem as so central to the children of Ethiopia. The challenge then is to develop and scale up products, policies, and delivery models to protect and nurture brain development in an equitable and sustainable manner. Someone needs to save my brain because I came out here without the clicker. So either you're going to click the slide or somebody can bring the clicker out to me. Perfect. That's wonderful. So what is the problem? Thank you. What is the problem that we're seeking to address? And many of these things have been referenced already in the talks this morning. The problem that we're seeking to address is the 1 in 3 children, that's 200 million children globally, who fail to reach their full physical, cognitive, psychological, and psychoemotional potential. due to poverty, poor health and nutrition, insufficient care, stimulation. I'll talk a little bit about the risk factors and the approach in a moment, and of course other risk factors. So enabling this whole movement of early child development in the first 3 years of life, as we've heard throughout the conference, has very important returns, including economic returns of 7 to 10% across the life course through better education, health, sociability, economic outcomes, and even reduced crime, which I think was referenced this morning. The Global Strategy for Women, Children, and Adolescent Health, which is the implementation of the Secretary General's Every Woman, Every Child initiative, was actually relaunched this past fall with a focus on survive, thrive, and transform. So thrive is now in the global policy discourse. The real question, and this is the question I'm going to want to address with you, is how do we actually apply solutions? What solutions do we have? How can we actually apply solutions? How can we turn the types of knowledge we're hearing about here into concrete action for the world's children? Just to reference one of the earlier talks, we heard about Zika. Zika can be thought about as a threat to saving brains. So if you look at a holistic look at various risk factors, you see there promote health and nutrition, infection prevention and management is on there. Zika is a new saving brains threat. And actually, one should ask oneself what the GDP of Brazil in 20 to 30 years is going to be like, because there's tens of millions of cases of Zika, probably many more children infected than we know. Microcephaly is probably the tip of the iceberg. There's probably much wider effects on brain development and child development. We know that translates into effects on the economy and onto society. And over the last couple of days in some conferences in Washington, people were even comparing the Zika epidemic with the early days of the HIV epidemic. People are not asleep at the switch on Zika. There's a lot of activity on Zika. We heard, for example, about the President Obama's initiative, and the USAID launched a Zika challenge recently, et cetera, grand challenge. But it really is a social, economic, and public health emergency that maybe isn't garnering the type of resources that are needed to safeguard what the effect on Brazil and other countries in the region's economy and society could be like 20 to 30 years from now as the kids who are infected today grow up. Anyway, one of the niches in the Grand Challenge on Saving Brains is that we've taken a holistic approach. Whereas many people over many years have started with the independent variable. Take one risk factor like nutrition and say, nutrition's bad for brain development, I'm going to solve nutrition. Many people have done that over time, and they've calculated the economic benefits of it. But what we've done is taken a holistic approach, focused on the dependent variable, which is the brain development, the developmental potential of children. And we're risk factor agnostic because we recognize that the various risk factors operate in an interrelated manner, and different risk factors will be important in different jurisdictions. Think about Brazil and Zika now. That's probably the most prominent risk factor, but others are always in play everywhere. It doesn't matter if you're well-nourished, if you're a child soldier in northern Uganda. And so we really have to think about the independent risk factors in a holistic manner and just focus on, I love the Willie Sutton metaphor, you know, where the money is children's development. And let's focus on the dependent factor and how many brains we can be saving out of those 1 out of 3 children, the 200 million globally, who fail to reach their full potential. So against that grand challenge, the commitment to the Saving Brains Challenge in particular, and Grand Challenges Canada is funded by the Government of Canada, so these are public Canadian taxpayer resources. We've committed just over $42 million Canadian to just over 100 innovations and a platform in Thrival, in Saving Brains. And I'll describe some of those to you. This has happened over the past 5 years or so. And what this has turned into is probably the world's largest holistic pipeline of Thrival innovations. As I mentioned, it's updated, it's aligned with the Global Strategy for Women, Children, and Adolescent Health. There's actually a website called savingbrainsinnovations.net where you can see all these innovations categorized, including, I'm sure, Vishwajit's. And in terms of leadership, we've tried to catalyze this growing partnership on a focus on child development in low and middle income countries and the economic potential of that. And let me just say a word or two more about that before going on to the solutions. If you were an evil scientist and you wanted to make sure that developing nations really didn't develop, and the poor in the developing world, but also, as Alan was pointing out, and as many of the speakers have been pointing out, the poor in our own countries never really achieve social mobility, what would you do? What would you do? You'd actually do this. You would make sure that in the first 1,000 days of life, something happened to children's brains so they would never reach their full potential. And poverty would be transmitted generation after generation. And kids in poor families would be locked into poverty, whether they were kids in disadvantaged communities here in the United States or in Canada, or in low and middle income countries. So you could think about this problem as really a way of perpetuating poverty. And you could think about the solutions to this problem as a way of breaking out of poverty, both locally and globally. And that counterfactual of the evil scientist and what you would do, I think, is a very interesting one, because what that says to me is that this Saving Brains challenge is really one of the most fundamental societal challenges that we face. $100 billion a year to the economy globally, and as you'll see, that's an underestimate, and huge amounts of social suffering. As you'll see, this is related to violence, and you've heard. So this is a very fundamental challenge. So the issue isn't the challenge. We've heard a lot of knowledge around the challenge. The issue is, well, what are we going to do about it? What kind of solutions do we have in place? These numbers I won't dwell on, but just of those 100+ projects, these are the amounts of children who are using innovations to date, caregivers, workers trained. We're just, to Gary's point, we're following metrics and also metrics of child development and some core metrics across the projects. So we started out with some knowledge generation things. We used what I think was a relatively creative approach of a request for proposals to all those folks who had done randomized trials of a wide range of interventions in the first 1,000 days of life in the past. Many of those trials, and there were about 100 of them in low and middle income countries, many of those trials were actually oriented around survival innovations or child development innovations, but with short-term follow-up. And what we said is, okay, you did your trial 10, 15, 20 years ago. We will now give you some funds to follow up those children and to see what happened to them developmentally in the long term. It's actually, if you will, a poor person's way of getting a lot of information very quickly from randomized trials and previous things that were done. There's some really interesting preliminary findings from that initial, I think it was around $10 or $12 million of investment. And most of these are still unpublished, and I would be the last one to disclose unpublished findings and introduce pre-publication bias. So I would never do that. So I've listed them on these slides as associations, but just read through them and imagine a world, and I'm not saying that these associations are positive, but imagine a world where these associations actually were positive. Kangaroo mother care for low birth weight infants. And measuring the effect on schooling and wages at 20 years. Imagine if kangaroo mother care actually was protective of low birth weight infants 20 years later, and you could show pictures of kids' brains that were essentially normal if they received kangaroo mother care and ratty if they didn't, and the correlative issues in child development. Imagine if you were following up kids with malaria in Bangladesh, and you saw huge amounts of disability after not cerebral malaria, but severe malaria, and you're looking at the effects of rectal artesunate. Imagine if you're looking at the intervention of responsive stimulation and nutrition together on school readiness 4 years later in Pakistan. Imagine if you're looking at exclusive breastfeeding and its relationship to conduct disorders, cognitive development in boys in KwaZulu-Natal. Newborn maternal vitamin A supplementation and scholastic performance in Bangladesh, or multiple micronutrient supplementation and social and child development later in I think Indonesia. So these are all findings that haven't come out. I'm obviously not sharing the findings with you. I'm just talking about the associations. But imagine if all these associations were positive and there was some increased amount of knowledge here from what these risk factors actually are by taking that approach. And as an aside, we could talk in the discussion period about the crippling effect of academic publishing, and I think Vishwajit actually referred to this, on saving lives and improving lives in the developing world. But that's a separate discussion in terms of timeline. We've also funded some economic work. I mentioned before that the global strategy for women, children, and adolescent health said that the total cost to the world economy of this problem of ignoring child development, they're actually talking about maternal newborn child health overall, is $100 billion a year. Well, the cost comes from the child development side. It doesn't come so much from the child survival side. That's where the costs of this problem are in MNCH. And we supported some modeling, and again, unpublished, but I can tell you the number is significantly larger than $100 billion a year. And I think this will become apparent soon. And you can also segment it by country. As you see on the website here, you can zoom into, imagine you're a finance minister, and you can zoom in on your country, and you can see what the GDP lost of all the, related to each of the various risk factors of poor child development are. So, you know, for example, malnutrition and other types of risk factors. This is still a snapshot of things to come, but imagine if you could do that and how that would motivate you to actually make investments in your own country. That's the kind of stuff that's coming. But what I want to do is shift specifically to some examples of, some concrete examples of innovations that we're funding where we're seeing solutions roll out. So this one, and I'm not going to go through all the text on the slides, this was based on the Jamaica studies of child development. Are people familiar with the studies in Jamaica? So these were very well conducted trials, and I find them very interesting because they are actually the ones that have most shown the effect on violence of innovations like in the Jamaica program, home visitation, far out, 20 years out. And these have actually been shown to reduce gun violence. So it's actually not only the $100 billion of benefits, it's also the social factors of violence. And what these folks have done is they took all their materials, how to make toys cheaply and locally, how to do the home visitation program. And this was essentially a knowledge translation project. They put them all on a website and made them available to other country governments who wanted to implement similar home visitation projects, and partnered with the Inter-American Development Bank and launched this at the Inter-American Development Bank, which, as you know, has governments as customers. And this was launched last September, and we see early users like Zimbabwe, Guatemala, Brazil taking this up. So this is the idea of taking the materials in a randomized trial, the actual how-to, how do you make the toys, how do you do the visits, et cetera, of this home visitation program that's an evidence-based program shown to work, and disseminated it globally to governments. Because what we know from our work in scaling is at the end of the day, you can't push a string. You've got this pipeline of innovations, but at the end of the day, especially for things like this, it is the domestic governments in low and middle income countries that need to have the uptake, that need to integrate this into their programs, that need to fund it. And this is an example of a tool to do so. This is an interesting project that I visited called Mobile Creches. It's really amazing. It turns out that in India, about 3 million children of migrant workers on construction sites are lacking access to basic education, basic nutrition. So I visited one of these outside a large city in India, and you're kind of walking in, you get through this chain link fence, you're walking through these muddy paths. Essentially, it's a migrant camp. You see the building going up in the background, where normally the kids would have been up on the cranes with the parents. And you're walking through, and all of a sudden you get into the middle, and there's this bright, vibrant, fun-filled creche full of, the day I was there was about 100, 120 children there, from very young ages to a little bit older, and they're being stimulated, they're being nourished. So these are the most vulnerable children. These are children of migrant workers. And here is an innovation that, as you can see, is spreading to many sites. You see that under outcomes in India, spreading to many sites in terms of this innovation. It's incredible to watch these kids flourishing in the middle of this most impoverished migrant situation. And again, here's a situation where this NGO, Mobile Creches, is starting to negotiate with the builders to bring on resources from the construction industry, from the companies, to help support these creches. So it's an example of a social enterprise that is really tackling this problem for a particular segment of the population. Kangaroo mother care has been referenced several times today. We know that it saves lives. We also know that it saves brains from other work, including the work that I didn't exactly reference on the slide a few slides ago, showing that it was protective against for low birth weight children 20 years later. But we also know it hasn't scaled. And so, as Vishwajit, I think, was saying, the problem here is how to scale kangaroo mother care. So in this case, we supported some original work from the Kangaroo Foundation in Colombia, where they conducted the randomized trial I referenced earlier. Let's just say they might have shown that it was protective in terms of low birth weight children 20 years later. We then supported them to go to Cameroon and Mali and essentially do all the operational work you need to get it going in clinics and to be reaching out to mothers and to be measuring the rates of kangaroo mother care. And then, as a next layer, we worked with Social Finance UK to develop a financial innovation called a Development Impact Bond, which was essentially a pay-on-success model, where success includes putting up the rate of kangaroo mother care. And now this whole package of things is finding its way into the country plan for Cameroon in the context of the Global Finance Facility for Every Woman, Every Child, which is a World Bank multi-billion-dollar financial facility that is there to finance country-led packages of maternal, newborn, child health in the countries in the Global Finance Facility. So it's a good example of how an innovation can start with a trial, generate some knowledge, turn a little bit more operational, layer on a financial innovation, and then link it to a situation where there's significant resources to scale. And we've done some modeling with and without the bond. That's not shown on this slide. But you can actually model out that you'll save many more brains and get much more kangaroo mother care with the financial innovation. Then of course, the question, these are all high risk. Then, of course, the question is, does it work? And that's the question that would be answered by actually implementing it. And by work, I mean scaling kangaroo mother care. We know we know the intervention itself is effective. What we don't know is actually how to get it to scale. And I take the point that that you were making earlier, that this is also an issue in personal behavior. And so, is the financial incentives to the caregivers dealing with the women and men going to actually achieve this? Is it more of a personal behavior? These are the elements that we need to chip apart. But here you see a serious attempt to actually scale this innovation, which saves lives and saves brains. Here's an example, and those were all what we call transition to scale grants, the ones I showed you. We would have typically invested $1 million Canadian with another $1 million or so coming from a partner, so those are $2 million plus projects. Now I'm going to go through some seed projects, which are earlier projects. This one is in Peru, in a very poor municipality called Carbello, where approximately 4,000 children have developmental delays, and it's one of the poorest municipalities in Lima. The innovation is coaching to improve parenting behaviors and early learning for at-risk children by community health workers in individual and group settings. It includes nutritional support. Typically, many of these innovations include a combination of responsive parenting and nutritional support, which, by the way, as a kind of reformed or retired physician, I just found it amazing when I started to look at the results of these trials that responsive parenting actually has as strong an effect as nutritional support. So if you start at this from a biological standpoint and you're looking at the signal to noise, you're really bowled over by the importance of the types of human family interactions that were talked about earlier and how they're actually of comparable signal, shall we say, comparable strength to some of the more biologically oriented interventions like nutrition. Anyway, this one in a seed showed a very significant signal of the innovation. And what this project is about is now integrating it into Peru's government program called CUNAMAS for early child development. And a lot of the work, a lot of the theory of change here is fund an innovation, do it in a local region, show that it can work, collect the evidence, work with the domestic government that then uptakes that innovation into its program. Because scale is actually, when you get over the issue that you have to go from knowledge to action and you've actually got some solutions, and then you've got some solutions and you're collecting evidence on those solutions, the next fundamental problem you almost always run into is the problem of scale. And even worse than scale is the problem of sustainability. In other words, who's going to pay for that innovation once the last Canadian taxpayer dollar is spent? And early partnerships with domestic governments, or if appropriate, with private sector entities, are essentially the way to address that challenge. So here's an example in Peru. Here is an example, and somebody referred to this earlier. I think Gary referred to it earlier. He was the hashtag he to she person in the conference here. And by the way, just as an aside, I'm really proud that of all our innovations, we have 700 innovations, as Gary mentioned, 70 of them are transitioning to scale because we have venture capital approach. So 90% are seed, $100,000 to $200,000 of grant funding, and 10% are transitioning to scale with $1 million, $2 million of grant or non-grant funding. Very proud to say that of that latter group of the 70 innovations, the transition to scale, 50% of those are actually led by women. So the gender lens here really matters, and we're currently in the process of studying the differential effect of that leadership. But here's a he to she thing. Here's the Hanoi School of Public Health, which had the idea of if fathers played a more important role in creating safe, nurturing, and supportive environments, would that help child outcomes? And the innovation was a program to mobilize more fathers in parenting through multimedia messages, group health education, individual counseling, fathers clubs, et cetera, friendly competition. They found that in the intervention group, and these are preliminary findings, fathers were more supportive towards exclusive breastfeeding, and fathers had more positive attitudes and generally had a good effect on the breastfeeding. So here's an example. This is essentially 100% social innovation, but a social innovation that can be extremely important. And by the way, we do have a concept of integrated innovation. We will support technologies, we'll support social innovations, we'll support financial innovations. We actually love to see them coming together as integrated innovations because that's what we think is needed for innovations truly to scale. So here's an example of fathers clubs in Vietnam and potentially scaling that social innovation to achieve more breastfeeding, more stimulation, and better child development outcomes. This is an example in Bangladesh combining the Thinking Healthy program, which is a program developed in Pakistan for treatment of maternal depression, and I know that risk factor was referenced earlier, with some child development innovations in terms of stimulation and nutritional innovations, the type we were talking about earlier. In 474 mothers with depressive symptoms who were screened for depression. And the early results show that maternal depression improved. That's usually, you can usually show that with the Thinking Healthy program. But in this one, you're also getting early signals that the child development is actually improving also when you're treating maternal depression and stimulating the children. There was an earlier study done by a group in Pakistan that showed that the treatment of maternal depression alone, at least in their context, was not that strong in terms of the child development outcomes, at least in terms of physical growth. So there's a lot of gaps in the information, in the data, but it seems like combining these types of innovations is really what's needed to achieve the type of child development outcomes we're needing. And rates of maternal depression can be very high, and it can be very debilitating as mothers maybe don't interact as much, don't stimulate their children as much, aren't as responsive in their serve and return functions with children. This is the last innovation I want to give you, I want to show you, but it refers to something Alan was talking about earlier, which is the role of caregivers. So I also had the opportunity to visit this and to speak with this young boy whose name is Israel. And Israel had just joined this essentially creche, and he was withdrawn, he was shy. You can see him in the picture. I'm doing my best there to show him, I don't know, what is that, a hippopotamus or something? But he's really not that into it. And it was really interesting. And as I left, and I was just there visiting for an hour, he started crying, which really shows you a couple of things. It shows you the thirst for attachment and for the type of trust and things. And actually, one way of thinking about this overall, and this might sound a little bit schmaltzy, but essentially these innovations, these interventions all have to do with love. They have to do with loving children, responsively interacting with them, feeding them. I mean, what do all those things have in common? And so what Israel had pretty clearly was that's what he was really seemed to be lacking. And so you really see a lot. Now, this program is a very high quality, and you can see it in the background behind me there, very high quality creche that combines very high quality childcare with nutrition and trained ECE people, et cetera. And it's right in the middle of a slum. And the idea of this social enterprise, which is called Kidogo, is to link that situation with the situation you see in the bottom slide. Many times you have a very extensive situation of informal caregiving in these slums. So parents go to work in the city. They leave their kids, sometimes about 15 at a time, as you see in the picture, in the care of an informal, completely untrained caregiver. When I visited this one case here, you can see they're kind of sitting in a dark room. They're not playing. Their nutritional standards are not great. So the idea of Kidogo is actually to link the demonstration project right in the same neighborhood, just a block or two away, of very high quality childcare with excellent nutrition and excellent standards in a hub and spoke model with many of these situations that you see below, and raise the capacity of that informal caregiver to raise the abilities of the caregiving system generally. And I think, Alan, this is very much along the lines of what you were referring to earlier, but in the context of an extremely impoverished community living in a slum outside of Nairobi. And again, this is a social enterprise, the models being tested, et cetera. So I'm exactly on time. I've spent 30 minutes talking to you about saving brains and the portfolio, and that leaves us with, I think, about 10 minutes for a good interaction, and would really love your feedback. But just to summarize my key messages. Number one, this problem of child development, call it saving brains, call it children thriving, whatever you like to call it, is perhaps the most fundamental social and economic challenge that we face in the world today, domestically and globally, because the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, are universal. So there's actually no distinction between domestically and globally. And you see the very same types of situations, although maybe with different manifestations in our own impoverished communities. So this is a huge grand challenge. It's maybe the grandest challenge. Secondly, and that's because the implications are so huge, economically, socially, and in terms of the future health of the children, in terms of their mental health, in terms of obesity, in terms of everything else, non-communicable disease. Secondly, we are at a point where the global policy environment has now started to recognize the relevance of thrival. We'd previously been just looking at survival, which I think was really shooting ourselves in the foot globally, because thrival is actually what is most salient for parents. If I said to you, hey, great news, your child has survived, that doesn't really resonate with you. You expect your child to survive. I mean, what every parent wants is for their child to reach her full potential. It's a much more salient argument. So rather than pushing from survival, we can pull the message from thrival, which I think is much more effective in children reaching their full potential. We have a lot of knowledge about this area, including some very important fundamental knowledge that was reviewed through this conference, some of the measuring techniques that are being developed in a Gates sub-challenge here. But the real issue is, how do you translate that knowledge into innovative solutions? And that's where the grand challenge approach really comes in. So then I showed you a portfolio of where we actually attempted to do that with $40+ million and 100+ innovative solutions. And we don't expect all of them to succeed, but you can see that many of them are starting to gather the type of evidence that is actually needed to succeed in a local jurisdiction. And it's happening in a community where the knowledge is being shared. So then, if you're starting to develop the evidence on these innovations, the next question becomes, how do you actually scale them in a sustainable manner so that 1 in 3 children who do not reach their full potential ultimately will? And that's, roughly speaking, where this portfolio is at. So my request to you is join us, work with us, and look very much forward to your discussion and comments and questions. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention.
Peter, thank you very much. I think you so well illustrated the way you're looking for innovations in science, in social innovations, in business, in management, and in so many different aspects, and driving those into impact all over the world. So thank you for sharing this experience. We do have some time for questions, so let me open it up to you. Does anybody want to know how to get a hold of Peter? Oh, here we go.
So it's a fantastic question. It was really a question of, are there any of these programs considering for replication in quote unquote developed countries, shall we say? You know, let me just say this. Every structure, every institutional structure we have in government is set up to prevent that. It's set up to say, here's a funding silo that's called international development, and that's meant for poor kids in poor countries. Here's a funding silo that we have for domestic development. Let's call it Head Start. That's meant for kids in the United States or kids in Canada. So when you actually try and do that, it's very easy to be dissuaded based on the administrative structures of government. I see that slowly changing. And I see that many of these innovations, and certainly much of this knowledge, is extremely useful domestically in Canada and the United States, including in our Aboriginal communities. I mean, one of the great shames of Canada is the health of Aboriginal children. And this issue of child development and intergenerational poverty, I think, is extremely core. So where have we gotten on that? One example of a project we funded in several Latin American countries was about screening for hearing loss in very young children, correcting the hearing loss, of course, then preventing the developmental delays. That project, as I mentioned, we funded in Latin American countries, and then a domestic Canadian foundation is in the process of funding it in Aboriginal communities. So that, to me, is absolutely the sweet spot. And think about that in your own situation. I wanted to highlight, though, how difficult that is and how creative our approaches are going to need to be to actually make that happen. But the day when we actually truly see the transferability of innovations, and we've for a long time thought about how our great innovations could be transferred or sometimes imposed on people in low and middle income countries, we've never really thought that much about the reverse flow of innovations. And actually, in recent years, people have written about that, but it's so easy to write about, so hard to do because of what I mentioned. And now we're starting to see it happening. So there's one example. But when this dam really bursts and things really are starting to move and go to scale is when that barrier will be solved. And I do see individual examples happening, but I don't see a systematic process, with one little exception. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has an RFP they put out about 6 weeks ago, which I found really creative. It's called Solutions for U.S. Healthcare, or Global Solutions for the U.S., or something like that, which is all about this. It's about find a model in a low and middle income country and import it into the U.S. So I think this is something where, as we look forward on the next few years, scale and sustainability and the issue of reverse innovation are two very frontier issues where we can really build and move forward as a global community in solidarity.
I mean, if I could answer something just quickly along those lines, I personally think that kangaroo mother care is something that every baby all over the world could benefit from. And frankly, I think we're missing an opportunity in our own neonatal intensive care units here to provide that kind of nurturing care for our babies here. And I think that's a great example of how we could learn a lot from the Global South.
And we do have little snippets, like the Kangaroo Foundation in Colombia has imported the practice and it's being used in intensive care units in Quebec, but they're often isolated examples. There's no systematic approach to that problem.
Peter, I'm going to ask you a question. I think one of the things that you've also tried to do through your initiative is be very thoughtful in how you bring people together, how you bring them to the table, how you engage with them, how you bring out the best in them in terms of innovation, and then package those innovations together for good elsewhere. Could you reflect a little bit on that process about sort of building communities of practice and bringing people around the table? One of our main objectives here is really to bring people together and connect them, for example, to people like you. But often people don't know, how do I get linked in, and what does that process look like if I do?
So our founder, our original board chair, a gentleman called Joe Rotman, was a merchant banker. And he spent many years in the oil and gas business. And he did everything, including his financial success, through partnerships. And so our focus the whole time has always been on partnerships. So, and why? Because these challenges are way too big for any one group to solve alone. So we keep our focus on the end beneficiary. We focus on partnerships. What does that mean? That means reaching out actively to other groups who are like-minded and starting very early in the conversation to assess whether there's mutuality of values. That's really the core issue early on, is whether one shares the same values. And it doesn't help, we've discovered, and I think I'm just stating the obvious, it doesn't help to delude oneself on that score. So in an early conversation, and this is, I guess, my advice, which is what you were asking, ask yourself not whether this person has the money you want, whether this person has the knowledge you want. Ask yourself whether this person shares the values that you share in terms of your common cause, in terms of reaching end beneficiaries, helping end beneficiaries. And from that, everything else follows, including the necessary trust building that will happen as partners start to work together. That's obviously more complicated when they're partnerships of unequals, including with some of these groups in low and middle income countries there. One has to be very ginger, but at the end of the day, it is the country-led platforms. It is the country leadership. The Grand Challenge is Ethiopia's, and ultimately the people in communities. And Vishwajit, this would be a point that really cross-references his point, really listening to the voices. So, I've been to, for me, the most gratifying moment is actually when I'm able to meet someone who has been helped by one of these innovators in one of these projects and really understand from their perspective what that feels like and work backwards from there. And so to your question about partners, if you have partners who feel the same, that's probably a good sign. And it all starts with the end beneficiary. And it's actually amazing, Gary. I grew up as a professor of medicine and various other things. I think many of the structures in medicine, I'm sure not here at Stanford, but many of the structures in medicine are actually set up to almost put veils in front of our eyes about what really matters. What really matters here is papers in Science and Nature. What really matters here is grant funding. What really matters here is A, B, C, D. What really matters at the end of the day is that end beneficiary, in my view, how you've helped them, how many of them there are, and how sustainable that situation is. And if we're able to put our focus there, and that could be an end beneficiary in a low and middle income country, it could be someone like somebody referenced the baby they visited earlier today. That, I think, is a great place to start with our thinking and to work backwards from there. And that also informs, I think, the approach to partnership. But my advice to young people is find a problem and solve it. And to know that you've solved it, it really has to do with those end beneficiaries. Maybe it sounds corny, and it, and maybe it's self-evident, but I think there's a lot of structures in academic medicine that go against that. One of them I alluded to earlier. There's a lot of knowledge that we're sitting on here. And a lot of it is because, somebody wants to wait for 3 years to get rejected from Science, and then get rejected from Lancet, and then publish their thing in the American Journal of this and that, which might be a closed access journal where they're publishing their knowledge 3 years later for an impact factor of 1.8. Like, give me a break. You're missing every policy window along the way, and you're missing every opportunity to help people along the way. And I know a lot of the open access things started here, and now the post-publication review of things like F1000 research. But that's just a small example of, if you shift your thinking and you start thinking about how I can help end beneficiaries quickly, significantly, in a sustainable manner, and work backwards from there to the various structures that we have in academic medicine, then I think at the end of the day, especially young people in the room here, will find they've lived a more gratifying academic life. And that's certainly what I'm starting to find working with great humility with a huge range of fantastic people in our organization around the world.
Peter, thank you so much. And this is a fantastic reminder for all of us. I mean, we've really aimed to bring people into the room who are all along that value chain, from very, very basic science on down to the final mile of linking with the beneficiaries out in places like India, and how critically important it is for all of us to be thinking about what is the end goal. And from the very beginning of that scientific enterprise, how can we be achieving ultimately that impact out in the world? So thank you very much for being with us and for your words of wisdom.